The sun hung low over the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of gold and rose as the warm breeze whispered through the tall grass. Beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient oak tree, its roots deep as the secrets it guarded, stood Clara May Turner, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. The oak sat beside Dawson Creek, where the water shimmered like melted silver. It was a sacred place for Clara, ever since she was a little girl playing along its banks. But today was not like the carefree days of her childhood. Today, she stood there as a woman in love, waiting for the man who had stolen her heart with quiet smiles and promises of forever. Daniel Rhodes appeared in the distance, walking toward her with his hat in hand and his saddlebag slung over his shoulder. He was tall and sunburned, his face rugged from days spent under the unforgiving sun. His boots crunched softly over dry leaves, and Clara's breath caught in her throat. "You're really going then," she said softly, trying her best to keep her voice steady. Daniel stopped in front of her, his dark eyes full of affection and regret. "I have to, Clara. There ain't no future for us if I don't." He took her hands gently in his. "I can't ask your pa for your hand till I've got something to offer, land, a home, a life worthy of you." Clara blinked back tears. "I don't need land. I don't need riches. I'd live in a barn with you if I had to." Daniel gave a soft chuckle but shook his head. "You say that now. But you deserve better. So I'm going on this cattle drive. 6 months, maybe a year. When I come back, I'll have enough to start building us a life." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn silver locket. Inside, Clara already knew, were their initials carved with his pocketknife. He had given it to her months ago. Now, she unclasped it from her neck, only for him to push it gently back into her palm. "No," Daniel murmured. "You keep it. And I'll take this." He reached for his hat and placed it in her hands. "So we'll both have something to remember the other by." Clara clutched the hat to her chest as if it were made of glass. The brim still smelled faintly of pine and smoke, Daniel's scent. She tried to smile through her tears. "Where will you find me when you come back?" Daniel lifted her chin, his thumb brushing away a tear. "Right here," he whispered. "Under this old oak, when the wildflowers bloom again." "And if they don't?" she asked, voice trembling. "They will," he said firmly. "And so will I." He pressed his forehead to hers, breathing her in like a man starving for air. Then, before she could speak again, he stepped away, swung himself onto his horse, and tipped his head in a silent farewell. Clara didn't chase him. Didn't cry out. Didn't beg. She stood rooted to the earth as his silhouette grew smaller and smaller against the rising dawn until all she could see was dust. Then she looked down at his hat in her hands. She pressed it to her heart. And she made her own promise. "I'll wait. No matter how long it takes." Under the oak tree, Clara May became a sentinel of hope, watching the seasons change, waiting for the day her cowboy would ride back to her. The first spring passed slowly. Clara May visited the oak tree every morning, Daniel's hat perched gently atop her neatly pinned hair. She sat beneath the shade with her sewing basket or book in hand, pretending to be at peace, yet always glancing toward the distant road, watching for a familiar silhouette on horseback. Every rustle of wind, every faraway hoofbeat stirred her heartbeat with hope. But the months slipped by like grains of sand through her fingers. Summer scorched the grasslands golden. Autumn set the leaves ablaze in copper and flame. Winter arrived with its bitter silence, frosting the creek with thin sheets of ice. Yet Daniel did not return. People talked. They always did. "He ran off, Clara. Men like him don't settle. You're a pretty girl. Don't waste your youth on a dream. A woman who waits on a cowboy waits alone." She ignored them. Suitors arrived at her father's shop, young farmers, widowed men with good reputations. They brought flowers, sweet pies, and polite conversation. One even arrived with a ring in his pocket. But Clara always smiled gently and declined, her answer unwavering, "My heart is already promised." Her father, John Turner, was a patient man, but even he grew weary. One evening, as Clara sat mending Daniel's hat for the third time, despite it hardly needing fixing, her father spoke softly from across the room. "Clara, child. It's been over a year now." She paused, needle frozen mid-stitch. "Daniel will come back," she replied, voice steady but soft. Her father sighed. "And if he doesn't?" Clara looked up, meeting his tired eyes. "Then I'll still be here when he does." John shook his head. "You're too young to live like a widow for even being a wife." That phrase echoed through town. Folks began calling her the Oak Tree Widow, a title spoken with equal parts pity and awe. And truthfully, Clara wore it without shame. Because a widow mourns a love that was real, and so was hers. Every spring thereafter, she brought wildflowers, purple hyacinths and golden bells, to lay at the roots of the oak. She spoke to him aloud, as though he were simply late, not gone. "Daniel, the creek's running lower this year. Daniel, Mrs. Whitaker's cow had twins, can you believe it? Daniel, I still wait for you." Sometimes, she felt foolish, talking to an empty horizon. Other times, she felt stronger than ever. Because believing in him, in their promise, gave her purpose. There were moments Clara battled out. Nights when she cried into his hat, whispering "Where are you?" Days when the silence felt heavier than chains. But every time despair threatened to consume her, she remembered his words. "Right here. Under this oak, when the wildflowers bloom again." He was not a man who spoke lightly. He made no promise he did not intend to keep. So if he was not here, he must be unable to be here. That was all she needed to know. Years rolled by. She grew from a hopeful girl into a woman tempered by patience and faith. Her hands became skilled, her back strong, her eyes wiser. Yet when she sat beneath that oak, clutching his hat in her lap, she felt 17 again. Still believing. Still waiting. Because love, the truest kind, does not fade with time, it endures it. It was a stormy evening when everything changed. Thunder rolled across the prairie like cannon fire, and rain beat down on the roofs of Dawson Creek with a vengeance. Most townsfolk hurried indoors, shutters drawn tight. But Clara May stood at the window of her father's shop, watching the road with an ache she could never quite silence. Lightning flashed, and in that white streak of light, she saw him. A lone rider approached, slumped in his saddle. His horse, mud-splattered and weary, stumbled with each step toward the livery stable. The rider's coat was torn, his hat missing, his face hidden beneath tangled hair soaked by rain. He dismounted shakily, nearly falling before catching himself against the stable door. Something tugged deep in Clara's chest. Not recognition, no, not yet. But something else. Something like a memory waking from a long sleep. The next morning, the town was buzzing. "Stranger at the hotel," they whispered. "Came in half dead. Doc patched him up. He don't speak much. Won't say his name." Clara tried to ignore it. But curiosity gnawed at her. That afternoon, while delivering bread to Mrs. Whitaker, she passed by the saloon and saw him. He stood on the porch, leaning heavily against the post, watching the street with weary eyes. His face was hidden beneath a rough beard, his left arm bound in a sling. He looked like a man who had been to hell and barely crawled back out. Clara slowed. Her breath caught. Around his neck hung a silver chain. A familiar one. Her heartbeat slammed in her chest. It can't be. The stranger looked up. Their eyes met. For a moment, the world went still. No wind, no chatter, just the thrum of her pulse in her ears. His eyes, dark, tired, but painfully familiar, searched her face with disbelief. She stepped forward. "Where did you get that locket?" The man stiffened. He glanced down at the tarnished silver resting over his chest. Clara's voice trembled. "I carved those initials." His fingers curled over the locket protectively. CT+DR. His voice was hoarse, as if unused for years. She swallowed hard. "Daniel?" He looked like he'd been struck. The silence that followed was heavier than any storm. People nearby paused, watching curiously. The stranger, Daniel, shifted uneasily, as if torn between stepping forward and bolting. Clara didn't wait for him to decide. She walked up to him, eyes burning with tears she had held back for years. Slowly, trembling, she reached out, and laid her hand against his cheek. He flinched. Not from pain, but from disbelief. "It's you," she whispered. "You're alive." His throat worked, his lips parting soundlessly. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. "Clara. I..." But before he could finish, his knees buckled. She caught him as he fell, calling out for help. Men rushed forward to lift him inside. The town doctor hurried over. Clara stayed at his side, clutching his hand even as he drifted into unconsciousness. People whispered around her. "Is that him? The one she waited for? Could be. The Hat Girl's cowboy. Lord have mercy. He came back after all." But Clara heard none of it. She leaned over him, tears slipping freely now. "I knew you'd come," she whispered. And for the first time in years, she was no longer waiting alone. "You said." Daniel awoke to the soft glow of lantern light and the faint scent of lavender. He lay in a small, familiar room, Clara's childhood bedroom. The quilt beneath him was patched with faded blue squares, hand-stitched with care. His injuries throbbed, but the ache in his chest was stronger. Not pain, regret. He turned his head and saw her. Clara sat in a chair beside him, fast asleep, her head resting against the bed frame. Daniel felt his breath catch. Her hair was a little longer, her face older, but her expression, peaceful even in sleep, was exactly as he remembered from 100 dreams. Slowly, he reached out and brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. Her eyes fluttered open. For a moment, she simply stared. Then she sat up straight, hands shaking as she leaned forward. "Daniel," she breathed. He swallowed, guilt burning through him. "Clara. I'm sorry." Her eyes filled with pain, not from doubt, but from how deeply she felt his remorse. "Tell me," she whispered. "Tell me everything." And so he did. He spoke slowly, voice rough from years of silence. He told her how the cattle drive had gone smoothly at first, until their caravan was ambushed by outlaws in the Texas Panhandle. Some men were killed. Others, like him, were taken alive and forced into labor at a hidden camp deep in the desert. They were stripped of names, treated like animals, beaten if they resisted. He tried escaping 3 times. Each time, he failed. Each time, he thought of her. "Clara," he murmured, voice trembling, "every night, I'd lay in the dirt and stare at the stars. I'd picture you under that oak tree. It was the only thing that kept me human." She covered her mouth, tears falling silently. "Years passed," he continued. "I stopped knowing how long I'd been gone. But I never forgot. Not once." She reached for his hand. "How did you escape?" she asked softly. Daniel's jaw tightened. "A flood. The camp washed out one night. Chaos everywhere. I grabbed a horse and ran. I didn't even know where I was going, I just kept riding north. Took me months to get here. I didn't know what I'd find." Clara squeezed his hand fiercely. "You found me," she said, voice firm despite her tears. "I never left." Daniel looked away, shame darkening his face. "That's what I was afraid of," he whispered. "That you hadn't left. That you'd still be waiting. Waiting for a man who didn't deserve you." Clara's eyes widened. "Don't you dare say that." He turned back to her, startled. "I waited because you were worth waiting for," she said fiercely. "Not because I was foolish. Not because I was trapped by a promise. I stayed because I knew you'd come back. Not new in my head, but here." She pressed his hand to her chest. "In my soul." Daniel's eyes glistened. "I ain't the same man you remember," he rasped. Her voice softened. "Neither am I, but I don't love who we were. I love who we are." Silence settled between them, heavy, but no longer painful. Finally, Daniel spoke. "Clara. I don't know if I can be whole again." She leaned forward, pressing her forehead to his. "Then let me be the one to help mend you." And as they stayed there, hand in hand, breath against breath, the shadows of their past no longer loomed like chains. Instead, they became the soil from which something stronger would grow. "You said," spring returned to Dawson Creek like a long-awaited hymn. The wildflowers were blooming again, lavender, gold, and crimson dancing across the meadows like brushstrokes on God's canvas. The creek ran fuller this year, its waters singing against polished stones. And beneath the ancient oak tree, two figures stood side by side, no longer separated by time or fate. Daniel Rhodes had regained much of his strength, though the scars on his body and the faint limp in his step were reminders of all he had endured. Yet with Clara's steady presence beside him, he seemed taller now, more sure, more grounded. He no longer looked like a ghost wandering through borrowed days. He looked like a man who had finally come home. Clara wore a simple white dress, her hair loose and kissed by the wind. She held Daniel's old hat in her hands, the same one she had guarded all those years. Daniel stood beside her, holding the locket she had once carved with trembling fingers. They didn't speak for a while. They didn't need to. The oak tree above them swayed gently, as if blessing their reunion. Finally, Daniel turned to her, nervousness flickering across his features. Clara smiled reassuringly, as though she could feel the rhythm of his anxious heartbeat. He took a deep breath. "Clara May Turner," he said softly, voice trembling with emotion. "I made you a promise years ago, right here under this tree. I told you I'd come back for you." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't look away. "And I told you I'd wait," she whispered. Daniel nodded. "You did. Longer than any soul should have to. Longer than I deserved." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. From it, he retrieved a ring, simple, handcrafted, its band etched with tiny wildflowers. "I ain't a man of fancy words," he continued, voice shaking. "But what I am is yours. If you will still have me." He dropped to one knee, slowly and carefully due to his injuries, but with all the determination of a man who had crossed years and deserts for this very moment. "Clara May. Will you be my wife? Not someday. Not when things are perfect. But now. As I am. As you are." Clara let out a sound that was part laugh, part sob. She fell to her knees with him, cupping his face in her hands. "I waited under this oak for years," she whispered. "Not for a wedding. Not for a ring. I waited for you. And now that you're here, Daniel Rhodes." She stuck out her hand dramatically, beaming through tears. "You'd best put that ring on before I lose my patience." Daniel laughed, a pure, unguarded laugh she had longed to hear. He slid the ring onto her finger, his hands trembling. She threw her arms around him, and he held her like a man who would never let go again. As they stayed there, kneeling beneath the tree of their promise, the townsfolk, who had quietly gathered at a distance, erupted into cheers. Some wiped their eyes. Some chuckled softly. The oak tree widow was a widow no more. Later that day, Daniel lifted Claire onto his horse, just as he had all those years ago. Only this time, he mounted behind her, not riding away alone, but carrying his future in his arms. They rode past the fields, past the whispering creek, past the life that had once stood still. Clara looked back only once, at the oak tree that had been her companion through loneliness and faith. Her hand rested over her heart where Daniel's hat now hung once more. No more waiting, she thought. Only living. And so, beneath a sky washed in gold, they rode, not into the unknown, but finally, into forever.